Es regnant, it rains. So let's take this opportunity to concentrate our attention on the Chomsky problem as a spiral staircase, or maybe double helixes floating in the hair, which will take us to a higher development. Chomsky seems to be the very bleeding edge, or the far radical position from within this sort of spectacle. So remember the old, how do you pronounce the name? Guy Debord? I don't know, Guy Debord. Remember that old text about the spectacle? I read it once and understood nothing from it except that we're supposed to consider everything that happens within the society to be adding to, as it were, the quantity of energy in the system. So the entropy can't happen. Nothing can happen except sort of constantly bringing more heat into the system. So Chomsky presents everyone who isn't himself as speeding the plow of the system. But why isn't he himself just, as he says, a ceremonial figure of the kind that the system actually most wants? So his description, I don't know if I'm actually doing him any injustice. It's simply that he just very keenly feels a sort of modified Marxism. So if you start with Marxism, you have the view that the most advanced practices, or the strong dominant practices in economics, are primary, and people's thinking is secondary, or the quote-unquote ideology is secondary, or the propaganda proceeds from the economic base in such a way that it's made to produce some kind of faith. Or I think there's a definition given in the time of Woodrow Wilson when he founded this government agency for reducing under, I think it's somebody called Peel, or the Peel Commission, something like that. And Peel gives a definition of propaganda where he says, we're not going to do propaganda in the German style, but instead we're going to do a propaganda which, and I forget the exact phrase, but it's something like promulgates faith, or something like that. So why isn't Chomsky simply promulgating the faith of the system to which he stands at the top of, and says we do not need philosophy, and we don't need theory, and we don't need anything but honesty? This seems very doubtful, because one, just from the normal perspective, you have to think there's people like Cass Sunstein and Samantha Power who wrote this book, Genocide: The Problem from Hell. And you have in the normal policy department people who are undoubtedly sincere. And so Chomsky's sort of mentally ill picture, like that anybody that supports on principle and consciously the current system must be simply greedy and must be out for themselves. But that's impossible to believe, I think, from just a straightforward point of view. But then you could say, okay, but the preponderance of people that support the current system are out for greed. And it gets more questionable, but then the lawyers say, should we go with what the preponderance say or the more weighty argument? The quality versus the quantity comes in here. But putting that aside, I think one can say Chomsky's argument is basically like he follows Walter Lippmann, who's followed the Marxist kind of track, and he talks about manufacturing of consent, which really means the superstructure or the ideology follows the so-called core or the economic base. And then he gives this image of like all these sort of, I regard them basically as drones, all these kind of drones that like to talk about for 40, 50 years, along with, say, I think he's just a Ponzi schemer, basically, straightforwardly, is Richard Wolff, who will tell you that here's the solution, capitalism is in its last stages, and he's been saying this decade after decade after decade, and there's plenty of people willing to buy it, and the people that are go in for that are almost always have never read a serious book in a serious way. They may have read a serious book, but not in a serious way. They may have read something of Nietzsche casually. They may have read something of Camus casually, but they didn't actually think it over. If they ever actually learned to think, then they would realize they have to leave Chomsky and Richard Wolff behind. I think this is objective. I think this is really objective. You could just see it happening to certain people. And what happens is you got a lot of semi-educated people, people with several degrees or whatever, but who have never really done any Erfahrung or any thinking, as it were, but always just a sort of repetition of what the experts say, and an excessive respect perhaps for experts because oneself is an expert in some niche. Chomsky then says, basically, I think the image that, besides from analogizing him, or not just analogizing him, but saying he's sort of a neo-Marxist in that basic respect that I just outlined, I think the image that most captures him is this saying that wouldn't the powers that be like it, the people that own the media, for instance, like it, the billionaire class like it, if instead of politicians we had mere ceremonial office holders. So like we had King Charles, but it's like King Charles in a can or whatever. The Queen of England was the example he gives. So this is the Queen of England that's what made me think of it. This kind of person, Stephen Fry, for instance, even though Stephen Fry probably knows the Queen of England in person and would be very polite to her when he spoke with her, I believe he at the same time kind of despises the notion of royalty, even though he says, actually that's interesting in Fry, he admits that somehow royalty works even though it doesn't make sense. It's actually good for England, even though he personally is of such a disposition or inclined to despise it in an irrational way. But what if everyone were just like a ceremonial figure like the Queen of England in politics as a whole? Then Chomsky says the powers that be would really like that, because then there'd be nothing to, then the public would waste their time electing these ceremonial figures that had no power, and they would just run things directly by owning things through the private sphere, which is so seems to be such a sublime ginning up of life to so many right-wing people, I think. The notion of the pure private sphere. Which shows, I think, in America how both right and left wing are totally dedicated to this, which Dugin opposes, this so-called classical liberalism, which is still playing out. But I think I want to say, to follow Chomsky's logic, Chomsky himself is the ultimate ceremonial figure, totally useless. People look at him, is making some noises, but everything he says is totally within the logic of the spectacle, right? So it's useless. So this is both an expose showing the nakedness of Chomsky in a clear way, I think, but we can also, again, concentrate our attention on this point where Chomsky fails precisely because he's totally stays within the simple intelligibility which we get when we don't think, when we don't move from anima to animus, when we don't move from merely in an error Leibniz way, in a way of just inner drifting inner experience. We don't lift up and make this separation where we then do also this thing that the intellect does, which breaks into the language as it's being used, looks at it, challenges it, separates it. And when we read a text like Nietzsche like this, on every page you'll have 5, 6, even 20 points where you need to turn your gaze into a meditation, ruminate, and change the meaning of the words on the page.